Attention! Straighten the line!
When the guns fell silent, what became of them? You think you know what happened when the Reich collapsed, how justice came swiftly, how the guilty were punished, and how history closed the book on that dark chapter. But the truth is more elusive, more unsettling. When the smoke cleared in May of 1945 and Europe's ruins were still warm, not every villain wore the face of a man. While the world's eyes fixed on the Nuremberg trials, on the grand spectacle of high-ranking Nazis facing judgment, thousands of others simply disappeared into the folds of civilian life. Among them were women, many thousands of them who had worn the same black uniforms, who had stood on the same killing grounds, who had shouted the same orders that sent countless lives into the gas chambers. They were not bystanders. They were not victims of circumstance. They were perpetrators. And yet, most of them walked free. The history of female SS guards is one of the most disturbing silences of the post-war world. These were the women who manned the watchtowers, who held the rifles, who kept the roll calls under the freezing dawn. They oversaw punishments and selections, ran the kitchens and the medical wards where experiments tore bodies apart. Their names were written in the same ledgers that recorded death quotas and shipments to Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, Buchenwald. They were part of the machine that turned cruelty into routine. And when that machine broke down, when the Allied tanks rolled through the gates of the camps, these women vanished. In the photographs of liberation piles of emaciated bodies, wide-eyed survivors wrapped in rags, you rarely see the faces of the guards who ran those places. Some were caught, of course. A few like Irma Griese, the Beast of Belsen, were tried and hanged. But for everyone who faced the gallows, hundreds melted into anonymity. They cut the insignias from their uniforms, tore the pages from their records, and re-emerged as housewives, nurses, teachers, or shopkeepers. To the world rebuilding itself, there was no time to look back. Germany was a shattered land filled with millions of displaced people, widows, orphans, and ruins stretching from Hamburg to Munich. The Allies had bigger problems: Reconstruction famine, the looming shadow of the Soviet Union. The bureaucratic hunt for war criminals took second place to the desperate need for order. And so many of these women slipped through the cracks with terrifying ease. Imagine a young woman walking through the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin in 1946. She carries a suitcase, perhaps forged papers, a modest dress. She tells the local employment office that she had worked in a resettlement facility or as a clerical assistant. No one asks what that means. No one wants to know. Within months, she's teaching in a local school or working as a nurse in a children's hospital. Her neighbors see her as a polite, quiet widow, perhaps even a victim of the war herself. But at night, when the sirens of memory wail in her dreams, she sees what she did. The faces she beat the prisoners, she selected the screams that echoed through the barracks at Ravensbrück. And then morning comes and she smiles as she walks her child to school. For decades, history chose not to speak of her. The world prefers its villains to be monstrous, unmistakable, easy to recognize. But evil rarely looks like a monster. It often wears the face of normalcy, the smile of a neighbor, the hands of a nurse or a teacher. In post-war Germany, evil lived quietly in tidy kitchens and small apartments. It baked bread, it sewed dresses, it read bedtime stories to its children. The story of what happened to the female SS guards after World War II is not just a tale of escaped criminals. It is a mirror held up to the failure of justice, to the weakness of memory, to the ways societies choose to forget when remembering is too painful. When the trials began in Nuremberg, the world thought it was witnessing the full reckoning of Nazi crimes. Cameras rolled, judges read verdicts, and the newspapers declared the age of accountability had begun. But the truth is, those courtrooms were only the tip of a massive, invisible iceberg. The male architects of genocide faced the world's judgment. The women who helped carry it out, who manned the gates, swung the whips, filled out the transport list, faded into history's background noise. They were not ghosts. They were flesh and blood. They had names, families, and futures. And they built those futures on the bones of the dead. Some of them were barely 20 when they joined the SS. They were promised steady pay, clean uniforms, and purpose in a collapsing world. They were told they were serving their nation. And by the time they realized what that service meant, they had already crossed the threshold of humanity. It is easy to believe that the war ended cleanly, that justice was done, that evil was excised like a tumor. But history is never that neat. When the Third Reich fell, the debris it left behind was not only made of stone and steel, it was made of people who had learned to kill without conscience, and who now had to live among those they once condemned to die. For some survivors, justice never came. They saw their former tormentors walking the same streets, buying bread in the same markets, living quiet, comfortable lives, while their own nights were haunted by memory. Many survivors gave up trying to press charges. The courts were indifferent, the evidence too old, the witnesses too few. And so the world moved on. But every so often, a fragment surfaces, a photograph, a letter, a name, whispered in an archive, and for a brief moment, the illusion cracks. We glimpse the truth that the post-war years tried to bury, that the machinery of the Holocaust did not stop turning when the camps were liberated. It simply changed form. It became silence paperwork forgetting. This silence is what allows ordinary people to live with extraordinary evil. It is what allows societies to rebuild without reckoning, to write history books that skip over the uncomfortable parts. But silence is not the same as peace. It is only the sound of guilt growing old. The women who served in the SS camps may be dead, now their graves unmarked, their names forgotten. But their story remains alive in the records, in the testimonies of those who survived them, and in the moral questions they still force us to ask. What does justice mean when time erases the faces of the guilty? Can a society rebuild itself on foundations of unspoken crimes? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what would we have done had we been in their place? Because evil does not begin with monsters. It begins with choices. Small, deliberate, convenient choices made by ordinary people who tell themselves they're just following orders, just doing their job, just surviving. This is the story of those choices, the story of the women who helped turn cruelty into an industry and then slipped away unseen into the peace that followed the war. The women behind the uniform, power, obedience, and opportunity. They came from every corner of Germany, from small farms and quiet towns, from schools and kitchens and factory floors. They were not soldiers, not officers, not trained killers. They were daughters, clerk shop, assistants, ordinary women whose lives had been upended by war. Yet in a few short years, they would become part of the most efficient killing system the modern world had ever known. When the SS began recruiting women in 1939, it didn't announce it with fanfare. The call went out quietly through newspaper ads and employment offices. It offered what many young women craved in those bleak, uncertain times: security, respectability, and a salary that promised independence. The pay, 150 Reichsmarks per month, was double that of a factory worker. There was room and board vacations and the prestige of serving the fatherland. For many, it sounded like a way out of poverty or out of insignificance. Few of them at first understood exactly what serving at a resettlement facility meant. But once they arrived at Ravensbrück, the all-female SS training camp illusions vanished quickly. There, under the command of Johanna Langefeld, recruits were reshaped into instruments of discipline and authority. They learned how to keep order, how to break resistance, how to administer punishment. They were taught racial theory, the poisonous doctrine that some lives were worth less than others. Day after day, they absorbed lessons that stripped empathy away and replaced it with obedience. The process was methodical, bureaucratic, almost dull in its efficiency. Each woman was assigned a role, a uniform, and a purpose. The boundaries of morality were replaced by the boundaries of duty. They learned to salute, to take orders, to command others. To the SS, this was not merely employment, it was indoctrination wrapped in the language of professionalism. By the end of training, these women were ready not only to follow orders, but to enforce them. And for many, the transition came surprisingly easy. The most chilling thing about evil is not its brutality, but its banality. The same woman who learned to carry a whip by day might have written gentle letters home by night describing the camp as challenging work. In photographs, they look unremarkable, smiling, well-kept, often posing with dogs or flowers. You could pass one in the street and never guess what she'd done. Some, like Irma Grease, joined out of ambition. Grease was barely a teenager when she left school and applied for SS service. By 21, she had become one of the most notorious female guards in history, feared by thousands of prisoners at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Others, like Herta Ehlert or Maria Mandel, saw camp duty as a path to advancement, a chance to prove their worth to superiors who rarely saw women as equals. Within the twisted hierarchy of the SS, the camps offered a rare kind of power. It was a perverse empowerment authority through cruelty, respect through fear. For women who had spent their lives under the shadow of patriarchy, the camps gave them something intoxicating: control. They could command hundreds of prisoners, make life and death decisions, and move through the barbed wire world as figures of absolute authority. That power corrupted quickly. The lines between obedience and sadism blurred. In testimonies after the war, survivors described how some guards seemed to take pleasure in inventing punishments, forcing women to crawl across gravel until their skin bled, or making them stand motionless for hours in the snow. Others played cruel games with food, withholding rations to watch desperation unfold. Not all were monsters by temperament. Some were simply efficient administrators calculating how many prisoners could work before collapsing, or how many calories could sustain a laborer before death. They logged deaths in ledgers, signed transport orders, approved medical procedures. Their job was to keep the machinery running smoothly, and they did. And yet, in their own minds, many believed they were innocent. We were only doing our duty, they would later say. We didn't know what was happening. But the truth is that they did know. They smelled the burning flesh. They heard the screams at night. They watched prisoners vanish and never return. They filled out the paperwork that made those disappearances possible. The SS guards were not coerced at gunpoint. They volunteered, and volunteering meant consent. What's most unsettling is how ordinary their motives were. Few joined out of fanaticism. Most were driven by opportunity, by the simple human desire for a better life. For a poor girl from Mecklenburg or a baker's daughter from Berlin, SS service offered a rare path upward. Uniforms, wages, status. It felt like belonging to something greater, something powerful. But power has a way of mutating the soul. Once they stepped behind the barbed wire, the world outside stopped existing. Within those camps, humanity was rationed like bread, and cruelty became the currency of survival. The longer they served, the easier it became to obey, without question. Historians who study the female guards often struggle with one haunting question: did they understand what they were part of? The answer lies in the meticulousness of their work. They were not blind followers. They were willing participants in a system that rewarded obedience and punished doubt. They adapted, rationalized, and performed their roles with deadly efficiency. The camps themselves were built on such rationalization, each person performing a small, defined task that, when combined, produced mass murder. The women filled a critical gap in this machinery. They guarded the female barracks, conducted searches, assisted in medical experiments, and supervised labor units. They were indispensable. Without them, the system would have faltered. And yet, when the Reich fell, the world refused to see them as equal partners in atrocity. Perhaps it was easier that way. Easier to think of women as victims coerced into complicity, rather than as willing architects of pain. The idea of female brutality unsettled the public imagination. It didn't fit the narrative. It threatened to blur the line between innocence and guilt, between nurture and destruction. But history has no interest in comforting illusions. The truth is that many of these women found their purpose in the camps. They thrived in the structure the SS provided. They climbed its ladders, received commendations, and took pride in their efficiency. They weren't anomalies, they were products of their time, of a culture that had normalized violence, dehumanized entire populations, and turned cruelty into patriotic service. They believed they were serving their country. They believed they were keeping order. They believed they were doing what was necessary. And that is what makes their story so frightening, because belief can justify anything. When we look at their photographs, now smiling faces frozen in black and white, it's tempting to dismiss them as monsters wearing human skin. But to do that is to miss the deeper warning their story holds, that under the right conditions, with enough fear, indoctrination, and ambition, ordinary people can become instruments of unimaginable horror. The women behind the uniform weren't born evil. They became evil one choice at a time. Recruitment and Indoctrination: how the system created its servants. It began with an advertisement. In the autumn of 1939, when the war was still young and victory seemed certain, notices appeared in German newspapers calling for patriotic women to serve the nation in essential war work. The words were vague, respectable, harmless. They spoke of duty, opportunity, and service to the fatherland. No mention of concentration camps, no hint of gas chambers. Only a promise: steady wages, free lodging, vacation time, and a uniform. For thousands of young women facing poverty, uncertainty, and isolation in wartime Germany, the offer was irresistible. A job in the SS administrative system meant status. It meant escape from the drudgery of factory work or domestic service. It meant belonging to something powerful and orderly in a world collapsing into chaos. The Reich understood that appeal perfectly. Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp in Germany, became the central training ground for these recruits. Behind its walls, an entire curriculum was designed not only to teach discipline, but to remake the mind. For 3 weeks, the new arrivals learned how to live without compassion. Under the supervision of Chief Warden Johanna Langfeld, lessons covered everything from camp regulations to racial doctrine. They were taught the hierarchy of prisoners, Jews at the bottom, followed by Roma Poles, Russians, and political dissidents. They learned that kindness was weakness, that mercy endangered order, and that prisoners were subhuman obstacles to victory. Discipline was drilled into them relentlessly. Recruits practiced shouting orders, conducting roll calls, and executing punishments. They were told that hesitation was treason. Every command had to be obeyed instantly. Their voices had to be sharp enough to cut through terror. They were not simply learning to guard, they were learning to dominate. At night, lectures on racial theory filled the classrooms. Charts showed Aryan skulls beside Jewish ones. Instructors recited pseudo-scientific nonsense about blood purity heredity and the natural superiority of German women. The goal was to erase empathy through repetition to convince them that cruelty was not only acceptable but righteous. By the end of training, these women had been stripped of individuality and remade into parts of a larger mechanism. They no longer thought in terms of people-only categories, politicals, undesirables, workers. They no longer saw prisoners as humans deserving of pity, but as tools to be managed, disciplined, and when necessary, disposed of. The process was chillingly efficient. When their training ended, each woman swore an oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler and the Reich. They received their assignments to Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, Majdanek, Stutthof, or Bergen-Belsen. Some were nervous at first, unsure of what awaited them. But the system did not give them time to hesitate. Once inside the camps, they were thrust into a world where suffering was routine and death was procedural. Within days, the new guards adapted. They had to. Imagine arriving at a camp where the air smells of smoke and decay, where thousands of hollow-eyed prisoners shuffle through mud under the bark of dogs and the crack of whips. At first, you might flinch. You might look away, but soon you learn not to see. The human mind is adaptable in terrible ways. After a week, the sight of corpses no longer shocks you. After a month, you barely notice. After a year, you have become part of the machine. Many guards later claimed ignorance. They said they didn't know the full extent of what was happening. They insisted they were just clerks or supervisors. But the evidence tells a different story. Their training at Ravensbrück explicitly prepared them for brutality. They were shown how to conduct beatings, how to handle escape attempts, how to choose prisoners for labor or punishment. They were told that any sign of compassion would be seen as betrayal. There were rewards for obedience promotions, privileges, and praise from superiors. Those who performed their duties efficiently could rise quickly through the ranks. A handful became head wardens or administrative officers commanding dozens of subordinates. Others were transferred to extermination camps where their efficiency was rewarded with power over life and death. In this way, the SS turned ordinary women into willing servants of a genocidal system. The indoctrination was subtle and complete. It replaced empathy with ideology, turning cruelty into routine labor. These women were not coerced into evil. They were trained for it, incentivized for it, praised for it. Historians who studied the personnel files of female SS guards noticed something striking. There was no consistent social background. Some were well-educated, others barely literate. Some came from devout Christian families. Others were raised in strict party households. What united them wasn't ideology but conformity, the willingness to obey, to belong, to matter. The Nazi regime understood that power doesn't require belief, only participation. The system was designed to blur moral responsibility until no one felt guilty. If everyone obeyed, no one was to blame. And yet, within that illusion of obedience, there was always choice. A few women did refuse. A handful requested transfers after witnessing atrocities. Some were reassigned to factory work or hospitals. They were not executed for disobedience, as later myths claimed. They simply left. That reality exposes the central lie of post-war defense that refusal meant death. It didn't. They stayed because they wanted to. Ravensbrück's training created not just guards, but believers in hierarchy, women who saw the world through a narrow lens of duty, fear, and ambition. They were told they were the mothers of the nation, the protectors of racial purity. That flattery, combined with authority and a salary, made cruelty seem like service. When Allied soldiers liberated the camps in 1945, they found the evidence of that service everywhere. Ledgers of names, timetables of executions, instructions for punishment, and notes written in tidy handwriting describing disciplinary incidents. Some of those notes were signed by women. The handwriting was neat. The language was bureaucratic. The content was murder disguised as paperwork. To understand how such a transformation was possible, you must see the Nazi system for what it was: a machine that didn't need hatred to function, only obedience. The guards were gears in that machine. They didn't have to love killing. They only had to stop seeing the people they killed as real. This is how evil hides not behind rage or madness, but behind procedure and paperwork, behind the ordinary rhythms of a job well done. The SS didn't simply recruit killers. It manufactured them, one order, one lesson, one uniform at a time. By the time the war neared its end, more than 15,000 women had served as SS guards across occupied Europe. Most were between 18 and 30 years old. Many had joined for money, for adventure, or for belonging. Almost none imagined they would spend their youth inside barbed wire, watching death become routine. But when the Reich fell and the Allies began to ask questions, most of these women would tell the same story: that they had done nothing wrong, that they had been victims of circumstance. They would clutch that lie for the rest of their lives, because once you've been trained to obey, to forget to survive inside a system of horror, the most terrifying thing of all is to remember. Faces of Atrocity, the women who chose cruelty. History often hides behind numbers. 15,000 female SS guards, 800 tried, 200 sentenced. But behind those statistics are faces young, smiling, sometimes even beautiful faces that conceal what they became. To understand how evil took root in ordinary lives, you must look at the women themselves one by one and the choices that turned them into instruments of death. Irma Gries was one of them. Blonde, blue-eyed, barely out of her teens. She grew up on a dairy farm in northern Germany, the daughter of a strict laborer. Her childhood was marked by discipline, isolation, and propaganda. When she joined the SS at 19, she entered a world that promised her purpose and belonging. Within 2 years, she had become one of the most feared guards in Auschwitz and later Bergen-Belsen. Prisoners called her the hyena and the beautiful beast. She carried a whip, a pistol, and a trained dog. Survivors later testified that she would set the dog on prisoners for amusement, that she beat women unconscious for failing to stand straight during roll call, that she laughed while watching hangings. At her trial in 1945, she was asked why she had done it. Her answer was simple: "I was only following orders." But witnesses remembered her smile, the unmistakable satisfaction she took in power. When she was sentenced to death, she showed no remorse. She wrote letters to her family, read romantic novels, and on the morning of her execution, she said, "Quickly, please." She was 22. Then there was Maria Mandel, known among prisoners as the Beast of Auschwitz. Born in Austria, she had once trained as a postal clerk. The war gave her a uniform and the authority she had never known. She organized the women's orchestra at Auschwitz, not for the joy of music, but to play as prisoners marched to the gas chambers. She signed off on thousands of deaths. She was meticulous, efficient, proud of her work. When she was executed in 1948, she reportedly said she hoped God would forgive her. Dorothea Binz was another. At Ravensbrück, she served as head guard, feared for her unpredictable violence. Witnesses said she beat prisoners until her hands bled, that she chose pregnant women for punishment because they were too weak to work. Yet outside the camp, she was described as charming, even kind. She loved dogs, enjoyed picnics, and once posed for a photograph beside a lake, smiling, her uniform crisp and immaculate. She was 26 when she was hanged in 1947. And there was Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald. Married to the camp commandant, she became infamous for her collection of items made from human skin lampshades, gloves, book covers. Her cruelty transcended duty. It was theatrical, sadistic, performed as if she needed to prove that a woman could be as ruthless as any man. She denied everything, of course. Even when confronted with testimony from dozens of witnesses, she insisted she had been the victim of jealous rumors. Her sentence was later reduced, then reinstated. She took her own life in prison in 1967. Each of these women is a window into something profoundly unsettling: how power distorts humanity, and how ordinary desires, ambition, approval, control can lead to unthinkable acts. None of them were born to kill. They were shaped by a system that rewarded cruelty and erased conscience. But even within that system, there were choices. Historians have found records of women who refused orders, who asked for transfers, who couldn't bear to continue. They weren't executed. They weren't imprisoned. They were simply reassigned. That fact dismantles one of the greatest lies of the 20th century, that everyone had no choice but to obey. For women like Grace and Binz, cruelty became identity. Power was addictive. Inside the camps, the hierarchy was absolute. Guards could strike, starve, or kill without consequence. Prisoners were stripped of names, replaced with numbers. The line between duty and pleasure blurred until there was no line at all. Survivors remembered small details that lingered for decades. A guard who forced women to kneel on gravel until their knees bled. Another who poured cold water over naked prisoners in winter, laughing as they shivered to death. Another who stood watching while doctors performed experiments, taking notes as if it were a school exercise. What made these acts so monstrous was their routine nature. They weren't born of rage or madness, but of procedure. Evil in these camps was scheduled like work shifts. The guards clocked in, performed their duties, and went home to dinner. The contrast between their public and private selves is what horrified Allied investigators. In one diary found after the war, a female guard wrote about missing her mother, enjoying sunsets, and worrying about her weight. In another, she described a difficult day when disciplinary measures had to be carried out, referring to the beating of prisoners until they died. She wrote both with the same tone, the same detachment. Perhaps the most chilling image of all came from a survivor of Bergen-Belsen, who testified that after a day of executions, several guards, male and female, held a picnic on the camp lawn. They drank coffee, ate cake, and took photographs. In the background of one picture, smoke rose from a burning pit of bodies. What do you call that? Madness evil? Or simply the human capacity to adapt to horror until it feels normal? Each of these women eventually faced judgment, but their stories diverged dramatically. Some died quickly executed within months of capture. Others lived for decades, building new lives, pretending the past had never happened. One, Herta Botha, returned home after a few years in prison, married, and worked as a seamstress. She died in 2008, her neighbors unaware she had once served at Bergen-Belsen. The disparity in justice wasn't random. It reflected society's refusal to see women as true agents of violence. In post-war Germany, the image of a female perpetrator conflicted with national guilt and the need to rebuild. It was easier to think of them as misguided, coerced, or mentally unstable. Easier to forgive than to face the truth. But the truth doesn't disappear just because no one wants to speak it. When you study their lives, a pattern emerges. Before the war, many had lived ordinary lives, shopgirls, farm hands, clerks. The war gave them uniforms authority and a system that demanded obedience. And when obedience led to atrocity, they followed willingly, because disobedience required courage they did not possess. That is perhaps the most terrifying lesson of their stories, not how cruel they were, but how easy it was for them to become cruel. Their names have faded now, their photographs yellowing in archives, their crimes diluted by time. But every so often, a detail surfaces that reminds us of who they really were. A name on a camp roster, a note in a ledger, a face in a photograph. Each is a reminder that behind every historical atrocity are individuals who chose convenience over conscience and silence over compassion. The faces of these women still stare back at us from the past, young, composed, sometimes smiling. And if we dare to look closely, we might recognize something that unsettles us more than anything else: that they look like anyone. That is how evil survives, by looking ordinary. Judgment Day, when the camps fell and justice came knocking. The end came not with ceremony or confession, but with chaos. By the spring of 1945, the Reich was collapsing in every direction. The Allied armies were advancing from the west, the Soviets from the east. The sky above Germany was filled with the drone of bombers, the ground trembling with the march of liberation. Inside the camps, panic replaced order. The guards, once so confident in their authority, now looked over their shoulders. They burned records, destroyed uniforms, and fled into the night. But for millions who had suffered under their watch, the reckoning had finally arrived. When Allied troops reached the concentration camps, they were met with silence and then the unbearable stench of death. At Bergen-Belsen, soldiers stumbled upon 20,000 unburied corpses. At Buchenwald, they found the crematoria still warm. At Ravensbrück, prisoners too weak to stand saluted their liberators with trembling hands. Every step revealed the truth the world had refused to imagine. Among the wreckage of human suffering, the guards who had ruled these places were suddenly powerless. Some tried to run. Others hid among the prisoners, trading their uniforms for rags. But they couldn't hide the cruelty in their eyes or the posture of authority that had become second nature. When British and American troops began rounding up staff, they found women standing shoulder to shoulder with the men, confused, defiant, terrified. Irma Grace was captured at Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945. She was just 21 years old. Witnesses recalled her still wearing her SS boots, her expression calm, almost proud. Days later, American troops captured Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald, at her villa, where she had been packing jewelry and family photographs. Dorothea Binns was seized, trying to cross into the American zone. They were taken not as soldiers, but as criminals, their power stripped away, their future sealed in the hands of their former enemies. The trials began swiftly. The world had seen war crimes before, but nothing on this scale. The Nuremberg trials would capture the headlines, focusing on the architects of genocide, the Himmlers, the Goerings, the men who signed the orders. But elsewhere, smaller tribunals formed to handle the hundreds of lower-ranking officers and guards who had turned those orders into action. These were the trials of the camps themselves. The British held the Bergen-Belsen trial in Lüneburg beginning September 1945. 45 defendants stood accused, including 11 women. The proceedings were grim, clinical, and deeply emotional. Survivors took the stand, their voices trembling as they described the beatings, the starvation, the torture. They spoke of guards who laughed as children were dragged away, who kicked women to death, who treated human suffering as sport. When Irma Grace was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She stood straight, her blonde hair neatly combed, her uniform pressed. Her youth was disarming, her composure unsettling. "I only followed orders," she repeated. "I never killed anyone myself." But the evidence said otherwise. Survivors identified her again and again as the one who carried the whip, who unleashed the dogs, who enforced selections for the gas chambers. Prosecutor Colonel T.M. Backhouse read out the charges, each word like a nail driven into the coffin of illusion. "You exercised your authority with cruelty and malice," he said. "You did not merely obey, you commanded." The verdict came on November 17, 1945. Greece was sentenced to death along with 10 others. On the morning of her execution, British hangman Albert Pierrepoint described her final moments. She walked calmly to the gallows, smiled faintly, and said quickly, "At 8:07 a.m., the trapdoor opened. The youngest female war criminal executed by the Allies was gone." Her story would become infamous, her face immortalized in photographs and headlines. But what few remembered was how rare her fate was. For every Grease or Binns who faced the gallows, hundreds of others escaped judgment entirely. The British and Americans simply didn't have the capacity or the will to prosecute them all. Millions of displaced persons needed shelter, food, and medical care. The German infrastructure was in ruins. There weren't enough investigators, translators, or courts. Many female guards took advantage of that chaos. They destroyed their identification papers, changed their names, and claimed to be civilians or refugees. Without uniforms or SS documentation, they blended seamlessly into the masses. Some even received food aid from Allied charities, presenting themselves as victims of the war. The Soviets were less forgiving. When Red Army troops liberated camps in Poland and Eastern Germany, they showed little mercy. Some female guards were executed on the spot, others sent to Siberian labor camps. But in the Western zones, the process was slower, bound by bureaucracy and law. The first wave of trials ended by 1949. Out of approximately 15,000 female SS guards, only about 800 ever stood before a judge. Of those, roughly 200 received death sentences, though many of those sentences were later reduced to prison terms. By the mid-1950s, fewer than 50 women remained behind bars. Justice, once fierce and determined, began to falter. The world's attention shifted to rebuilding Europe, to the Cold War, to the looming nuclear threat. In the new political reality, Germany was no longer the enemy, but an ally against communism. The hunt for war criminals lost urgency. Files gathered dust in archives. Names faded from lists. And those who had once worn the skull and lightning bolts of the SS became teachers, nurses, shopkeepers, and grandmothers. Still, in those first post-war years, there were moments when the truth broke through. Survivors who testified at the trials spoke not only of their suffering, but of their need to be heard. They wanted the world to understand that the women of the SS had been just as brutal, just as guilty as the men. Their testimonies were raw and unforgettable. One survivor, a young Polish woman, told the court, "The guard who beat my sister was smiling. She told us, 'You are not human.'" Those words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Even decades later, that smile remains one of the most haunting symbols of the Holocaust. The smile of someone who believed cruelty was normal, who had been trained to think of murder as work. The liberation of the camps was supposed to be the beginning of justice. Instead, it became the beginning of forgetting. The photographs, the films, the piles of shoes and hair were too horrific to process. The world wanted to move on. It wanted to rebuild, not remember. And so, the record of what happened to most of those women faded into obscurity. But the truth remained scattered across documents, trial transcripts, and survivor testimonies that thousands of women participated willingly in the machinery of death. that most of them faced no consequence, and that history, perhaps out of exhaustion or denial, allowed them to vanish into the ordinary world they once destroyed. The war had ended. The camps were liberated, but justice, true complete justice, never came. The silence that followed would last for decades, and within that silence, the ghosts of the camps lingered unseen, unacknowledged, waiting for someone to ask the question the world had stopped asking. Where did they all go? Selective justice trials, gender, and the failure to remember justice in the years after the war came dressed in shadows. It was inconsistent, selective, and deeply flawed, more a gesture than a reckoning. The world wanted to believe that the trials of 1945 and 1946 had closed the book on Nazi atrocities, that the guilty had been punished, that the balance between evil and consequence had been restored. But beneath that illusion, thousands of perpetrators, especially women, had quietly walked free. The Allied tribunals were meant to bring order to chaos, but order was never possible in a land filled with rubble and ghosts. Millions of people were displaced, starving and traumatized. Bureaucracies barely functioned. Evidence was scattered across destroyed cities. Witnesses were dying of disease. And within that mess, the pursuit of justice became something selective, improvised, even arbitrary. At the top of the hierarchy were the Nuremberg defendants, the architects of genocide, the ministers and generals. Below them came the camp commandants and senior officers. And below them, still the guards, clerks, and secretaries, the minor participants. The system decided early on that not everyone could be tried. Not everyone could even be found. So someone had to draw a line. That line became the border between guilt and forgetfulness. At first, the Allies tried to cast the net wide. The British military courts in Lüneburg, Hamburg, and Dachau prosecuted hundreds of guards, both male and female. The French held trials in Strasbourg and Paris. The Poles and Czechs ran their own tribunals, often with harsher outcomes. But the further the process went, the more it faltered. Files disappeared. Witnesses lost hope. Public appetite for more trials faded. The machinery of justice began to rust. The difference in treatment between male and female defendants became impossible to ignore. Men were seen as fanatics, ideological warriors, symbols of Nazism's cruelty. Women, by contrast, were viewed through a softer lens as misguided, naive, or coerced. The judges, almost always male, struggled to see them as fully culpable. The press described them not as war criminals, but as girls, maidens, monsters, and skirts, a strange mix of fascination and dismissal. It was as if society itself refused to believe that women could embody pure cruelty. In one courtroom, a prosecutor referred to the female defendants as assistants to evil. The phrase stuck. It captured the comforting myth that women had merely followed orders, that their hands were guided by men, their will, not their own. It was easier that way, easier for a world still rebuilding, easier for post-war Germany to imagine its mothers and daughters as victims of manipulation rather than willing participants in mass murder. Yet the records told a different story. At Bergen-Belsen, women like Irma Grace and Elisabeth Volkenrath had directed punishments, supervised executions, and organized selections for the gas chambers. At Ravensbrück, Dorothea Binz and her deputies had run a regime of terror so brutal that even SS inspectors were shocked by its efficiency. At Auschwitz, Maria Mandel had commanded the women's camp with authority equal to any man. These were not assistants. They were leaders, architects of horror in their own right. Still, when their trials ended, their sentences often seemed absurdly light. Many received only a few years in prison. Some were released after serving half their term. A handful were freed early for good behavior. Herta Botha, who had served at both Stutthof and Bergen-Belsen, was sentenced to 10 years but released after 6. She returned home married and lived quietly until 2008. Hildegard Lechert, known as Bloody Brigitte, had beaten prisoners to death at Ravensbrück and Majdanek. She was sentenced to 15 years, released after 10, and later worked in a textile factory. When she was tracked down in the 1970s, she claimed she had only worked in the camp kitchens. Their stories were not exceptions. They were the rule. By the early 1950s, as the Cold War reshaped Europe, the will to continue prosecutions evaporated. Western Germany was now a crucial ally against Soviet communism. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's government prioritized stability and economic recovery over reopening the wounds of the past. The denazification program, once intended to purge Nazi influence, was quietly dismantled. In 1951, Adenauer issued an amnesty for thousands of war criminals, including many former SS personnel. The message was clear: it was time to move on. This shift wasn't just political, it was psychological. The German public was weary of guilt. They wanted to rebuild, to forget to believe that what had happened was the work of a few fanatics, not an entire nation. The idea that women, the same women who now nursed the wounded, taught school children, and cared for their families, had once enforced the horrors of Auschwitz was too unbearable to confront. Gender became the ultimate shield. In post-war media, female perpetrators were reframed as tragic figures rather than villains. Newspapers wrote of fallen women, corrupted youth, misled girls. Photographs of Irma Grisi and Maria Mandel were published not as mugshots, but as cautionary portraits, warning symbols of lost innocence. It was easier to eroticize their evil than to face it head-on. And so the myth of female innocence survived. For decades, historians ignored the subject. School textbooks spoke of male SS officers and Nazi soldiers, rarely mentioning the thousands of women who kept the camps running. Survivor testimonies were often dismissed as exaggerations when they described female brutality. The collective memory of the Holocaust became gendered evil, was male compassion, was female. The cost of that myth was staggering. Thousands of survivors, mostly women, had been tortured and killed by female guards. Their trauma was compounded by society's refusal to acknowledge who their abusers truly were. For them, justice was not just a matter of punishment. It was about recognition, about the world saying, yes, what happened to you was real. But even that recognition was denied. In one letter from a survivor to a British prosecutor in 1948, she wrote, "The woman who beat my sister to death now walks free. I saw her last week buying bread. She looked happy." That letter was never answered. The courts had closed. The documents were sealed. The photographs were filed away in archives. The silence became official policy. And so a generation of female perpetrators lived out their lives in peace, marrying, raising children, growing old. Their neighbors never knew. Their families never asked. The truth was buried under decades of respectability, but the silence was not complete. Every few years, a survivor would recognize a face. A journalist would uncover a document. A Nazi hunter like Simon Wiesenthal would reopen a file. And for a brief moment, the illusion cracked, revealing the rot beneath the surface of history. What those cracks exposed was not just individual guilt, but a collective failure. The failure of nations to hold all perpetrators accountable. The failure of societies to face the uncomfortable truth that women too can be executioners. Justice, after all, is not just about punishment. It's about memory, and memory, when neglected, becomes complicity. Forgiven or forgotten, when evil returned to ordinary life, when the trials ended, when the cameras were packed away, and the gallows dismantled, Germany entered a new era. not of remembrance, but of forgetting. The silence that followed was not born from ignorance. It was chosen. In the ruins of a defeated nation, the world's appetite for retribution faded quickly. The Allies had punished the most visible villains, the high-ranking officers and notorious executioners. That many believed was enough. The rest of the world wanted to move forward toward reconstruction, reconciliation, and a fragile peace. But for the victims who survived, justice felt unfinished. The faces of their tormentors did not vanish into memory. They appeared in markets, in hospitals, in classrooms, and no one seemed to care. For the female guards who escaped serious punishment, reintegration into post-war life came with startling ease. The chaos of defeat was the perfect disguise. Cities were in ruins, records lost, and identities fluid. It was a time when everyone was starting over. A forged paper, a new name, or simply silence was often enough to erase the past. Many returned home to their families, weaving false stories about their wartime service. They said they'd worked as nurses, typists, or administrators in resettlement offices. Few dared to press them for details. Germany in the 1950s was a society desperate to rebuild, not to interrogate. To question someone's past was to reopen wounds no one wanted to face. And so, thousands of women who had once worn the SS uniform slipped quietly into normalcy. Take the case of Herta Botha. Captured by British forces in 1945, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison for her crimes at Bergen-Belsen and Stutthof. Released early for good behavior, she returned to her hometown in Lower Saxony, married, and worked as a seamstress. For decades, she lived a quiet, respectable life. Her neighbors described her as kind, helpful, a good woman. She died in 2008. None of them ever knew who she really was. Or consider Hildegard Lecher, known among prisoners as Bloody Brigitte. She had been notorious for beating women with sticks and whips, for forcing prisoners to kneel on gravel until they bled. She was tried and sentenced in Poland, served 10 years, and returned to West Germany in 1956. There, she found work in a textile factory, later marrying and raising 2 children. When Nazi hunters tracked her down in the 1970s, she insisted she had only worked in the camp kitchens. By then, no one wanted to disturb the illusion. Stories like these were not exceptions, they were patterns. The denazification process, designed to purge German society of Nazi influence, quickly collapsed under its own weight. The bureaucracy was overwhelmed. Millions had been party members in one way or another. Questionnaires were issued asking Germans to declare their level of involvement. Most lied. Clerical work, they wrote. Administrative duty. Few investigators had the resources to verify those claims. The result was a vast, deliberate amnesia. For the female SS guards, this forgetfulness was a gift. Unlike their male counterparts, they drew little attention. They did not bear visible rank insignia or appear in propaganda photos. Their names rarely appeared in official records. Most had served in support or supervisory roles that left few paper trails. Their crimes were real, but easily erased. The public, too, was eager to absolve them. Post-war Germany was built upon the labor of women. They staffed hospitals, schools, and factories. They became nurses, teachers, and caretakers, the same professions that had once been the cover for their service in the camps. To accuse them now would have been to indict the very people holding the nation together. In that way, forgiveness and forgetfulness became indistinguishable. The moral reckoning that never came was replaced by a quiet collective lie that the women of the Reich had been victims, not perpetrators. This narrative fit neatly into a culture desperate to restore its sense of humanity. Women were portrayed as the ones who suffered most, who endured bombings, hunger, and loss. Their wartime service was recast as tragic necessity, their crimes as coerced obedience. It was easier, after all, to forgive the woman next door than to believe she had once selected prisoners for death. For survivors, this new reality was unbearable. Many lived with nightmares of female guards whose laughter still echoed in their minds. They had testified, identified their abusers, and watched them walk free. Some tried to confront them years later, only to be met with denial or worse, indifference. That was long ago, one former guard told a journalist in 1960. "We all suffered in those days." That phrase, "we all suffered," became the anthem of denial. It blurred the line between victim and executioner, transforming guilt into shared misfortune. By making suffering universal responsibility, vanished. And yet, the truth had a way of resurfacing. In 1964, a Holocaust survivor named Giza Weisblum recognized a face in a German newspaper. It was a photograph of Hermine Braunsteiner, a former guard at Majdanek, who had escaped to the United States and lived quietly in Queens, New York. Weisblum remembered her boots, the ones that had kicked prisoners to death. She contacted Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, who spent years gathering evidence. Braunsteiner was eventually extradited, tried, and sentenced to life imprisonment. But even she was released early on medical grounds. Her story symbolized everything that had gone wrong. Justice, when it came too late and too softly. By the late 1950s, the Cold War had consumed Europe's moral compass. West Germany's leaders argued that endless prosecutions would only weaken national unity. Justice Minister Fritz Schäfer publicly stated that continued trials threaten the morale of our people. The statute of limitations for most war crimes was set at 20 years. After 1965, unless new evidence emerged, no further prosecutions could proceed. And so history began to harden. Files were closed, cases were shelved, witnesses grew old, and silence became permanent. But in the quiet towns and cities of post-war Germany, the ghosts of the camps remained unseen, but not gone. The women who had enforced the rules of death now enforced order in classrooms, comforted patients in hospitals, and raised the next generation to believe in peace. They passed through the decades unchallenged, their pasts buried beneath routine. In their old age, some even gave interviews offering gentle reflections on difficult times. They spoke of shortages, bombings, hunger. They cried about how hard the war had been. But when asked about the camps, about the people they had once commanded, their voices faltered. "I didn't know," they said. "I never saw the killings. I only did paperwork." But there were survivors who remembered. And in their memories, the truth refused to die. The world's forgiveness had not been earned. It had been given too easily out of exhaustion, fear, and the longing to move on. And in that act of forgetting something sacred was lost the moral boundary between victim and perpetrator, the understanding that peace built on denial is no peace at all, because when evil is allowed to return to ordinary life, it doesn't disappear, it adapts. It hides in the faces of those we trust. It whispers in the stories we don't tell. And it waits for silence to finish what justice could not. The Ratlines, how faith and flight helped the guilty escape. In the years after Germany's surrender, Europe was a continent of broken borders and desperate souls. Millions wandered the roads, soldiers, refugees, widows, children. It was in this chaos that a new kind of exodus began, one not of victims, but of perpetrators. They called them the Ratlines, underground escape routes that carried former Nazis out of Europe and into safety. The name came from ships from the ropes sailors used to flee sinking vessels, and for the men and women who had built their lives on the machinery of death, those lines were lifelines. They led away from the gallows, away from justice, into the warm sunlight of anonymity. Most people have heard of SS officers like Adolf Eichmann or Josef Mengele slipping through these networks to Argentina or Paraguay. What's less known is that hundreds of women, the same who had guarded the camps, who had enforced the daily rituals of terror, escaped along those same routes. Their passage was made possible not by fellow Nazis alone, but by an institution that claimed to represent moral salvation, the Church. After the war, the Vatican and various Catholic charities ran extensive refugee programs, offering food, shelter, and papers to those displaced by the conflict. In principle, their mission was humanitarian. In practice, the chaos made it easy for the guilty to blend in. Priests, bishops, and sympathetic officials often didn't ask too many questions or asked none at all. One name would later emerge again and again: Bishop Alois Hudal. Hudal, an Austrian cleric stationed in Rome, believed it was his duty to aid good Christians fleeing communist persecution. In his mind, that included former Nazis. With access to Vatican resources and the Red Cross, Hudal helped forge identity papers that transformed war criminals into political refugees. These documents could then be used to obtain passports from countries like Argentina, Chile, or Brazil. He justified his actions by invoking mercy, but mercy in his hands became complicity. Among those who benefited from these ratlines were numerous female SS guards. Historians estimate that between 300 and 400 women who had worked in concentration camps used church-assisted routes to reach South America. Between 1946 and 1952, some fled through Italy boarding ships from Genoa or Naples. Others crossed the Alps into Switzerland, where sympathetic officials provided shelter before they continued on to Spain or Portugal, both governed by regimes friendly to former fascists. Their journey was often funded by stolen money valuables, looted from prisoners, or donations from Nazi sympathizers who had survived the war unscathed. When they arrived in Argentina, they found not exile, but community. President Juan Perón's government openly welcomed German immigrants. To him, they were skilled Europeans who could help modernize his nation. He asked few questions about their pasts. Buenos Aires soon became home to one of the largest German-speaking enclaves outside Europe. It was a world of bakeries, churches, and private schools where the past could disappear behind polite smiles and tidy storefronts. In this new life, former guards took on new identities. Some worked as nannies or teachers for wealthy Argentine families. Others found jobs in offices owned by German expatriates. A few married locals blending seamlessly into the society that had no interest in uncovering their secrets. One woman, once a block leader at Ravensbrück, became a school principal in Chile. Another, who had supervised executions at Majdanek, ran a small bakery in southern Brazil. Their children grew up bilingual, speaking Spanish or Portuguese at school, German at home, never knowing that their mothers had once stood over the dying. For decades, they lived peacefully, protected by distance time and indifference. Only occasionally did the past resurface. A visitor from Europe would recognize a face at a community gathering. A rumor would circulate about an old woman who refused to be photographed. Sometimes hidden trunks were discovered filled with letters, uniforms, or medals carefully preserved. But the truth rarely reached the authorities. Even when it did, extradition was nearly impossible. Argentina and Chile, both politically unstable and sympathetic to anti-communist causes, resisted requests from European governments. By the 1960s, most of these women were middle-aged, their crimes decades behind them. The world had changed. No one wanted to reopen the wounds. The irony was staggering. These women, once part of a system that worshipped order and discipline, had survived through chaos and deceit. They had been loyal servants of a regime that demanded absolute obedience, and yet they owed their freedom to forged documents and lies. The Church's involvement in these escapes remains one of the darkest footnotes of post-war history. Not every priest or bishop aided the guilty, but enough did to make the Ratlines thrive. Some believed they were saving souls. Others believed they were saving civilization from communism. But whatever their motives, their actions gave refuge to murderers. When asked decades later, survivors and Nazi hunters alike struggled to understand this moral collapse. How could an institution built on forgiveness become a shield for the unrepentant? How could compassion become corruption? The answer perhaps lies in the same weakness that allowed the Holocaust to happen, the human tendency to look away when faced with unbearable truths. Compassion, when stripped of justice, becomes a kind of blindness. By the 1970s, as global attention returned briefly to Nazi war crimes, journalists began tracing these Ratlines backward. They uncovered records showing how Red Cross travel papers had been issued in false names, how clergy in Rome and Genoa had personally arranged for tickets and visas. The paper trail was undeniable, and yet even then, few wanted to confront what it meant that mercy had been twisted into escape. Meanwhile, in Germany, the generation born after the war was beginning to ask questions their parents would not answer. They looked at old photographs, listened to whispers, and wondered what stories were missing from their family histories. For some, the answers came too late. By the time investigators reopened files in the 1980s and 1990s, most of the fugitives were dead. They had lived long, peaceful lives in foreign lands, dying under false names. Their graves bore no hint of who they had been. Their children, unaware, buried them with flowers and prayers. And so, the Ratlines succeeded not just in saving the guilty, but in erasing them. They proved that justice can be undone not only by denial or politics, but by mercy misapplied. They revealed how even institutions of faith can become tools of forgetting. For every Irma Grace who met the gallows, there were dozens more who vanished into the sunlit anonymity of the New World. They exchanged uniforms for aprons, whips for rosaries, and guilt for silence. And when they died, they took their secrets with them, leaving behind only the faintest trace of who they had been. In the end, that may have been their greatest crime, not merely what they did during the war, but how completely they escaped the memory of it. Because evil, when left unpunished, doesn't disappear. It migrates. It reinvents itself. It learns to hide behind kindness, behind charity, behind the quiet respectability of a life rebuilt. And for the world that allowed it to happen, the Ratlines were not just escape routes for the guilty. They were proof of how easily morality bends when comfort is valued over truth. The silent rebirth, West Germany's willful forgetting. By the time the 1950s dawned, Germany no longer resembled the nation that had sworn allegiance to Hitler. Its cities were skeletons of brick and dust. Its people were weary, ashamed, and desperate to begin again. The world demanded reconstruction. The Germans demanded normalcy. But beneath the new foundations, beneath every rebuilt church, every reopened school, lay an unspoken bargain. The past would stay buried, and the future would proceed as if nothing had happened. It was this silence that allowed the unrepentant to breathe again. The West German government, under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, made it clear that national healing meant moving forward, not looking back. The priority was economic revival, NATO integration, and shielding the country from communist influence. The pursuit of justice, once loud and righteous, became inconvenient. In 1951, the government passed a sweeping amnesty law, releasing tens of thousands of convicted Nazis and collaborators. War criminals, SS officers, and even some camp guards walked out of prison gates to applause from families who had waited years for their return. The language of the law was bureaucratic, emotionless phrases like national reconciliation and social stability. But behind those words was a quiet moral surrender. The message was unmistakable. The time for punishment was over. Public sympathy had shifted. War fatigue had hardened into denial. For many Germans, the trials and executions of the late 1940s had been enough a symbolic cleansing that absolved the rest by implication. They told themselves the guilty had been punished, and the rest had simply been caught up in the madness of war. Women especially benefited from this climate of willful amnesia. The same society that once celebrated their loyalty to the Reich now recast them as victims of its deceit. The narrative was seductive. They had been manipulated, brainwashed, coerced. They had followed orders because they were powerless. And so thousands of women who had served as guards, nurses, and administrators in the camps were folded back into the fabric of ordinary life with little more than a shrug. They became nurses again, teachers again, mothers again, respected members of communities that refused to question. In 1949, the newly established West German government conducted a survey among teachers in Bavaria. The results were quietly shocking. Over 60% had been members of the Nazi Party. No one asked how many had served in the camps, or taught racial purity in classrooms, or administered the youth programs that trained a generation to obey without question. No one wanted to know. To ask would mean acknowledging that the rot went deeper than the top. Instead, the focus shifted to economic recovery, the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. Germany's factories roared back to life. Cities rebuilt. Families bought cars and televisions. The scars of war were paved over with prosperity. For the first time in years, people could laugh again, dream again, forget again. But forgetting has its price. For survivors of the camps, that silence was unbearable. Many had returned home only to find indifference or hostility. Neighbors avoided them. Employers turned them away. Some were told they should be grateful to be alive. When they spoke of the female guards who had beaten them, people rolled their eyes. That's all in the past, they said. Why can't you move on? The silence wasn't just social, it was institutional. West German prosecutors rarely reopened cases against low-ranking camp personnel. Files collected by Allied investigators were quietly archived and ignored. The Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, established in 1958, focused almost exclusively on male officers. Female guards were considered secondary offenders. Their crimes, though horrific, were deemed less significant. The reasoning was as old as patriarchy itself. Women by nature could not be monsters. The newspapers reinforced this myth. When trials did occur, headlines focused on appearance, not guilt. The Blonde Beast of Belsen, one headline read. The Devil's Mistress, another. The language turned these women into grotesque caricatures, part villain, part seductress. It stripped their actions of meaning and reduced their cruelty to spectacle. By turning them into aberrations, the press absolved everyone else. For the general public, the myth of female innocence became a psychological refuge. It allowed mothers and daughters to remain symbols of virtue, untouched by the moral ruin of the Reich. It turned the Holocaust into a story of men's violence and women's victimhood, a story far easier to live with. But myths, no matter how comforting, rot the foundations of truth. In private, some of these women lived with their past, like a buried ember, quiet, hidden, but never cold. They avoided questions from their children, changed the subject when old photographs surfaced, and claimed they had been clerks or secretaries. In post-war reunions or church gatherings, they shared small coded acknowledgments with others who had served a name, a place, a look. Then the conversation would move on. Yet not all of them lived in denial. A few began to rationalize openly. They gave interviews to sympathetic reporters, insisting that they had never known what the camps were for. "We thought they were for criminals," one woman said in a 1962 broadcast. "We didn't know about the gas chambers." But her personnel file, uncovered decades later, listed her assignment, Selection Supervision Crematorium Sector. The lie was not for history, it was for themselves. The silence of the 1950s and 60s was more than collective denial. It was cultural anesthesia. The country needed to believe in its innocence to move forward, and so the sins of the past were wrapped in euphemisms softened by time, diluted by prosperity. The voices of the victims, those who remembered the screams, the whips, the boots, were drowned beneath the hum of rebuilding. In schools, textbooks spoke vaguely of the Nazi period, the war years, or the tragic events in Eastern Europe. Students learned dates, battles, treaties, but not names. Not Ravensbrück, not Auschwitz, not the women who had run those places with precision and pride. When the next generation asked their parents, said little. We didn't know, they claimed. It was a different time. And so the cycle of forgetting became inheritance. The 1960s would bring cracks to that facade, the trials in Frankfurt, the protests by young Germans who demanded truth from their elders. But for nearly 20 years after the war, silence ruled. And within that silence, thousands of female perpetrators lived out their lives, untroubled, unjudged, and unrepentant. They attended weddings, celebrated holidays, grew old. Some even received pensions from the same government that had once condemned them. They were grandmothers by the time the world rediscovered their crimes, if it ever did. And when they died, their obituaries described them as loving mothers, devout Christians, pillars of the community. The past, once again, remained buried. Because in West Germany's rebirth, truth was the only thing the nation couldn't afford to rebuild. The Ghost of Queens, Hermine Braunsteiner, and the Return of Justice. For nearly 2 decades after the war, justice slept. The courts had closed their doors, the archives had gathered dust, and the world had moved on. But sometimes justice awakens in unexpected places, in a face glimpsed on a city street, in the memory of a survivor who refuses to forget. In the spring of 1964 in Queens, New York, a woman named Giza Weissblum stopped dead in front of a German-language newspaper. On the page was a photograph of a smiling, middle-aged woman attending a charity event for European immigrants. Her hair was gray now, her expression mild, her name listed as Mrs. Russell Ryan. But Giza knew that face. She had seen it before 20 years earlier behind the barbed wire of Majdanek. She had watched those same hands now resting gently in the newspaper photo-kick prisoners with steel-toed boots until they stopped moving. She had heard the laughter that followed. The woman in the photograph was Hermine Braunsteiner, once known among prisoners as the Stomping Mare. During her years as an SS guard at Ravensbrück and Majdanek, Braunsteiner had developed a reputation for mechanical cruelty. She beat prisoners without reason, often with a riding crop, and was known to seize women by the hair and hurl them down staircases. Survivors recalled her fondness for polished boots, which she used as weapons. When Allied forces liberated Majdanek in 1944, they found her name on dozens of execution rosters, but by then she was gone. Braunsteiner had fled westward as the Soviet army advanced, eventually surrendering to the Americans. After a brief period of detention, she convinced her captors she had only been a clerk. With no documents linking her to the camps, she was released. In 1959, she married an American soldier, Russell Ryan, and immigrated to the United States. She became a housewife in Queens, attending church socials and volunteering for charity drives. To her neighbors, she was polite, devout, and unremarkable. Her transformation was so complete that even she seemed to believe it. But Giza Weissblum never forgot. When she contacted Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal in Vienna, her words were steady but urgent. "She lives in America," she said. "She lives free." Wiesenthal, who had dedicated his life to tracking down fugitive Nazis, began his search. What he uncovered was not just a single criminal, but a symbol of everything the post-war world had refused to confront. For years, West Germany had quietly avoided extraditing its own citizens for war crimes. The United States, meanwhile, had naturalized dozens of former Nazis who had lied on immigration forms. When Wiesenthal brought the Braunsteiner case to light, both governments were forced to act. In 1968, the New York Times ran the headline, "Queen's Housewife Accused of Nazi War Crimes." The photograph that accompanied it showed her on her doorstep, surrounded by reporters clutching a Bible to her chest. Her neighbors refused to believe it. "She's the nicest lady on the block," one said. "She makes cookies for our kids." But the past doesn't vanish because someone stops believing in it. Under U.S. law, Braunsteiner's citizenship could be revoked if it was proven she had lied on her immigration application. She had sworn she had never participated in persecution or been a member of the SS. Both statements were false. The evidence was overwhelming survivor testimonies, camp records, photographs. Her lawyers argued that too much time had passed, that she was no longer the same person, that she posed no threat. But justice does not measure guilt by the present. It measures it by the past. The legal battle dragged on for years. Braunsteiner wept in interviews, claiming she had been young and foolish. She insisted she had only obeyed orders. Her husband stood by her, at first convinced of her innocence, later silent in disbelief. In 1973, after years of appeals, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that naturalized citizens who concealed war crimes could lose their citizenship. Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan was stripped of her American nationality and extradited to West Germany to stand trial. The proceedings in Dusseldorf lasted from 1975 to 1980. Survivors from across Europe came to testify. Many were frail, old, or sick. Some arrived in wheelchairs. They described her face, her voice, her boots. They spoke of the women she had kicked, the children she had sent to the gas chambers, the laughter that followed her cruelty. Each testimony chipped away at the polite facade she had built in Queens. One witness, a Polish woman named Helena, told the court, "I was pregnant. She kicked me in the stomach. I lost the child." She laughed. Another described how Braunsteiner had ordered her dogs to attack prisoners for failing to march in line. Throughout the trial, Braunsteiner sat quietly, sometimes crying, sometimes blankly staring ahead. She no longer claimed innocence, only obedience. "I did what I was told," she said. "If I had refused, I would have been punished." But the court and history had heard that excuse before. In 1981, the verdict came guilty of crimes against humanity. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. For the survivors, it was not vengeance they sought, but acknowledgement. As one said outside the courthouse, "Now the world knows we were telling the truth." But even that small victory was fleeting. In 1989, citing poor health, West German authorities released Braunsteiner from prison. She lived quietly in a nursing home for the rest of her life, dying in 1999 at the age of 79. She had spent more time as a free woman in America than she ever spent behind bars for her crimes. Her story remains one of the most haunting parables of post-war justice, a reminder that evil, when ignored, can settle comfortably into ordinary life. In Queens, her former neighbors were stunned when they learned the truth. "We never suspected a thing," one said. She was just Mrs. Ryan. The phrase became almost emblematic of a world that had learned to stop asking questions. What made Braunsteiner's case so powerful was not the scale of her crimes, horrific though they were, but the way she vanished into the crowd. She was not a fugitive in a jungle or a cave. She was a housewife, baking bread, paying bills, tending her garden. She lived among those who believed monsters only exist in stories. Her trial reawakened the world's conscience, if only briefly. It reminded historians, journalists, and ordinary citizens that the line between innocence and guilt can be terrifyingly thin, that the face of evil may wear a neighbor's smile. When she died, there were no protests, no headlines, no flowers. Her name faded back into the silence from which it had briefly emerged. But the record remains: the testimonies, the photographs, the court transcripts. They ensure that for once, history did not let her vanish entirely. And in that record lies a larger truth, the one the post-war world spent so long denying. The Holocaust was not only the work of men in uniforms and medals. It was sustained by ordinary people, including women who chose obedience over conscience, comfort over courage, silence over truth. Hermine Braunsteiner's story was not an exception. It was the echo of thousands of others who slipped away unseen and unpunished. But for a moment, in a courtroom in Düsseldorf, in the tearful testimony of survivors, in the gasp of neighbors who thought they knew her, the truth stood naked again. And justice, though late and imperfect, spoke. The last trials, when time and memory collide. By the late 1970s, the pursuit of Nazi war criminals had become a race not against governments, but against time itself. The world was growing older, the witnesses frailer, and the accused fewer with each passing year. What had once been an urgent moral crusade was now a slow, dignified march toward silence. The question had shifted from who will be punished to will anyone still care. For decades, the narrative of the Holocaust had focused on its architects, the Himmlers, the Goerings, the Eichmanns, the guards, the clerks, the secretaries, the typists. The ones who had carried out the daily mechanics of murder had been forgotten. But as the 20th century drew toward its end, a new generation of prosecutors and historians refused to let the file close. In West Germany, a handful of aging lawyers began reopening dormant cases. Many of them were children during the war, raised in homes where questions were met with silence. They grew up wondering what their parents had done, who their teachers really were, what truths had been buried beneath the country's prosperity. By the 1980s, they were old enough to act, and they did. Their work led to what would become known as the last Nazi trials. These proceedings were quieter, smaller, stripped of the spectacle that had surrounded Nuremberg. There were no crowds, no cameras, no fiery speeches, only gray-haired defendants, trembling witnesses, and the quiet hum of translation devices in courtrooms that smelled faintly of disinfectant and dust. Yet in their quietness, they carried a gravity that felt heavier than any gallows. One of the earliest of these renewed cases was that of Hildegard Lechert, Bloody Brigitte, the former guard of Ravensbrück and Majdanek. Tracked down by journalists in the mid-1970s, she was rearrested in 1976 and brought before a Berlin court. The charges were specific murder, torture, and participation in the selection of prisoners for the gas chambers. She arrived in court in a plain coat, using a cane, claiming to suffer from heart problems. Her defense argued that she was an old woman with no memory of those years. But the witnesses remembered everything. One testified, voice trembling, "She beat a woman to death with her own shoes." Another said she smiled while she did it. The court sentenced Lechert to 12 years. She served fewer than 5. By then, public interest in such cases had waned. Newspapers treated them as relics of a bygone era. The young saw them as stories from a black and white world disconnected from their own lives. Yet for the survivors who testified, these late trials mattered profoundly. They were not about revenge, they were about acknowledgement. They wanted to leave behind a record, a truth that could not be erased by silence or denial. In 1980, one prosecutor put it simply, "We are not trying to punish ghosts. We are trying to stop forgetting." As time moved on, the ghosts multiplied. The 1990s brought the reunification of Germany, and with it, a brief revival of moral reckoning. The archives of East Germany, long closed to the West, revealed new evidence, personnel lists, camp logs, and interrogation notes. Hidden within those files were hundreds of names of women who had never been charged. Many were already dead. A few were still alive, living quietly in towns across Europe and South America. It was during this period that the story of Irmgard Fürchner emerged, a story that would come to symbolize the final chapter in this long, unfinished saga. Fürchner had been a teenage secretary at Stutthof concentration camp, responsible for typing deportation lists, coordinating prisoner records, and relaying orders to SS officers. She had sat in an office safe from the screams outside while thousands were gassed, shot, or starved under the system she helped administer. For decades, she lived an ordinary life in northern Germany. She married, had children, and retired quietly. The world forgot her name. Then in 2019, German investigators found her personnel file. Her age, 94, did not protect her from prosecution. In 2021, she became one of the last living individuals charged with complicity in the Holocaust. The headlines called her the Secretary of Evil. When her trial opened in 2022, she tried to flee. She left her nursing home one morning, boarded a taxi, and disappeared for several hours before being caught. The image of a frail old woman running from justice 77 years after the war captured the attention of the world. It was absurd, tragic, and deeply symbolic. During the trial, prosecutors argued that she had been an integral cog in the machinery of death. She had not pulled a trigger, but she had made murder possible through paperwork, the quiet bureaucracy that kept the killing machine running smoothly. Survivors testified that even the typist knew. She must have known, one said. Everyone knew. The defense countered that she had been a child barely 19, that she had only done clerical work. But the court was unmoved. In December 2022, Irmgard Fürchner was found guilty of accessory to the murder of more than 11,000 people. Her sentence, 2 years probation. She never served a day in prison. She died in early 2023 free. Her verdict was symbolic, but symbolism has power. It was a reminder that even after 8 decades, the documents still spoke, the witnesses still remembered, and the past was not done demanding answers. The late trials, those of Lechert, Braunsteiner, Fürchner, and a few dozen others, were more than judicial proceedings. They were mirrors held up to humanity's conscience. They forced the world to confront not only the crimes of individuals, but the long chain of indifference that allowed those individuals to live unpunished for so long. They revealed a truth that many found uncomfortable, that justice delayed does not fade, it festers. It lingers in archives, in memories, in the quiet resentment of those who remember when others choose to forget. By the time the final Nazi trials concluded, most of the witnesses were gone, their testimonies preserved in recordings and transcripts. The courtrooms were emptier, quieter. There were no crowds, no applause, no headlines declaring closure, only a silence that felt both triumphant and mournful, the sound of justice finally whispering after a lifetime of being ignored. When the last judge's gavel fell, an era ended, not because all questions had been answered, but because time had stolen the chance to ask them again. The files were closed, the cameras turned away, the world moved forward once more. But history does not end when the guilty die. It ends when the living stop remembering. The last trials were not about punishment. They were about memory standing its ground against oblivion. They were the world's final attempt to speak truth before silence took over. And for a brief moment, that truth prevailed not loudly, but clearly, like the echo of footsteps fading down a hallway, long after the doors have closed. The myth of the innocent woman, how gender shaped the memory of evil. For decades after the war, the story of the Holocaust was told in black and white men as executioners, women as victims. It was a convenient division, one that allowed post-war society to rebuild without confronting its deepest contradictions. The image of the Nazi man was fixed, a monster in uniform, a fanatic, a face of absolute cruelty. The image of the woman, by contrast, was softer, tragic, naive, manipulated. A nurse, a mother, a secretary. Never the executioner, never the whip. This myth did not emerge by accident. It was built piece by journalists, judges, and even historians who struggled to reconcile the idea of femininity with the evidence of atrocity. In the chaos after 1945, people needed simplicity. They needed to believe that evil looked like something distinct and alien. The notion that ordinary women who cooked, sang, and loved could also command death shattered every social certainty, and so society chose disbelief. Newspapers called Irma Grease the blonde beast as if beauty itself were a crime too strange to process. Others labeled Dorothea Binns the Witch of Ravensbrück, cloaking her violence in myth rather than accountability. Headlines focused on their youth, their hair, their smiles, never on their victims. The cruelty of women had to be transformed into spectacle because the idea of women as willing perpetrators was too corrosive to endure. In courtrooms, judges echoed that same bias. They described the female defendants as misled, weak followers of male authority. Their sentences were lighter not only because the post-war system was overwhelmed, but because the very idea of punishing women for calculated cruelty felt unnatural to those handing down judgment. A man who killed was a monster. A woman who killed was an aberration, something inexplicable, even pitiable. But inside the camps, the victims saw no such difference. Survivor testimonies from Ravensbrück, Majdanek, and Auschwitz tell a story that history long refused to hear. The women who enforced the rules of the camps did not hesitate. They screamed orders, wielded whips, and beat prisoners to death with the same precision and zeal as their male counterparts. Some, like Maria Mandel, rose to ranks of authority and oversaw thousands of deaths. Others, like Hildegard Lechert, turned cruelty into routine, as if violence itself had become a language. What makes their crimes so terrifying is how ordinary they seemed within the structure of the camps. The women's barracks were often managed entirely by female guards. These women conducted roll calls, selected prisoners for punishment, and maintained order with brutal efficiency. To the prisoners under their control, they were not assistants. They were the law. The myth of innocence then was not a reflection of reality. It was a collective act of erasure. Gender served as a shield not only in court, but in culture. The same post-war Germany that refused to look too closely at its male soldiers turned its women into symbols of suffering and survival. They were the ones who had endured bombings, who had starved during the blockade, who had rebuilt the nation from ruins. The possibility that some of them had also built the walls of Auschwitz, guarded its gates, and written its death lists threatened the fragile foundation of national identity. And so a quiet deal was struck between guilt and gender. The men would bear the burden of evil. The women would be redeemed through silence. This myth persisted for generations. In films, novels, and documentaries, female perpetrators were almost always portrayed as victims of circumstance manipulated, coerced, or seduced by authority. Even when their brutality was acknowledged, it was framed through the lens of tragedy rather than accountability. Their motives were psychologized, their cruelty sexualized, their guilt minimized. The effect was insidious. By making female perpetrators the exception rather than the rule, society turned them into curiosities rather than warnings. Their crimes became anomalies instead of evidence of something deeper, that violence is not the property of men, but a human potential. Modern scholarship has begun to dismantle this illusion. The work of historians like Wendy Lower and Elissa Maylander has exposed the scale of women's participation in Nazi crimes. From secretaries who typed deportation orders to nurses who administered lethal injections, women were embedded in every layer of the system. They were not passive witnesses to the machinery of death, they were its operators. Lower's research in particular revealed a staggering fact: nearly 500,000 German women served the Nazi state in some official capacity, from camp guards to administrative staff to SS auxiliaries. Many volunteered. Many knew exactly what was happening. They didn't have to pull triggers to make murder possible. They only had to believe that obedience was duty and duty was virtue. And yet, even now, the cultural memory remains gendered. When people picture evil, they still imagine a man. The photograph of a female guard smiling beside a pile of corpses feels wrong, almost impossible, as though the camera itself has lied. That disbelief that reflects to protect the idea of femininity from the contamination of guilt is part of the reason so many of these women lived and died unpunished. But truth is not bound by comfort. The female SS guards of the Reich were not monsters in disguise. They were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances choosing cruelty because it was rewarded. They found power in domination, security in obedience, and pride in efficiency. Their story forces a painful recognition that morality is not guaranteed by gender and that evil wears whatever face the moment demands. When modern readers encounter the stories of Irma Gries or Dorothea Binns, there is often a strange fascination. How could someone so young, so seemingly human, commit such acts? The question itself betrays the myth. Evil is never extraordinary in its beginnings. It starts with small permissions, with indifference, with the comfort of belonging to a system that rewards compliance. It grows when people stop questioning, when empathy becomes inconvenient. The myth of the innocent woman was more than a cultural oversight. It was a moral failure. It allowed thousands of perpetrators to escape judgment. It diminished the suffering of those who had endured their cruelty, and it taught generations that gender could excuse participation in atrocity. Perhaps that is why the truth about these women still unsettles us. It doesn't just expose the crimes of the past, it holds up a mirror to the present. It forces us to see that evil is not an anomaly of monsters, but a capacity that lives within ordinary people. It reminds us that comfort, obedience, and self-preservation can be as dangerous as fanaticism. The women of the SS camps were not victims of deception. They were believers. They chose to serve, to participate, to look away. And when the war ended, the world looked away with them. For nearly half a century, that mutual silence stood unbroken. But truth, like a survivor's memory, never dies completely. It waits patiently, painfully, for someone to listen. The unearthed evidence, secrets buried, records found. For decades, history seemed to have settled into silence. The courts were closed, the survivors were aging, and the perpetrators had melted into the anonymity of peacetime life. The archives stacked in forgotten basements and locked government vaults gathered dust. But the past, like a buried body, does not stay hidden forever. Sometimes it surfaces by accident through renovation discovery or the persistence of those who refuse to forget. And when it does, it shatters the illusion of closure that societies build to protect themselves. In 1998, in the quiet suburbs of Hamburg, construction workers renovating a small, weathered house made a discovery that would reopen one of history's darkest chapters. Beneath the floorboards of a damp basement, they found a trunk, old, rusted, and wrapped in cloth. Inside were papers yellowed with age official Nazi documents, camp rosters, identification cards, and a diary written in careful looping handwriting. The name on the documents belonged to a woman, Gertrude M. born 1918, listed as a block leader at Ravensbrück concentration camp from 1942 to 1945. The trunk was in every sense a time capsule of horror. Her diary recorded the daily operations of the camp, not reflections of guilt or remorse, but meticulous notes. Roll call complete. 6 missing, 2 punished, 1 deceased. There were lists of names, ages, and nationalities of prisoners under her supervision. There were requisition orders for clothing rations and labor. Every page breathed the cold efficiency of bureaucracy, the language of murder turned into routine. And then suddenly, the records ended in May 1945. Further research revealed what had happened next. After the war, Gertrude returned home, married a widowed schoolteacher, and lived in that same house for 40 years. She died in 1986, a beloved grandmother and Sunday school volunteer. Her neighbors described her as warm, gentle, and devoted. No one knew. No one asked. The discovery stunned historians not because of what it revealed, but because of how ordinary it was. There was no confession, no dramatized guilt, no dramatic last words, just paperwork. Paperwork that proved how perfectly evil could disguise itself as administration. For decades, cases like hers had been invisible. The German justice system had focused on spectacular crimes, mass executions, experimental doctors, commandants. But the everyday cruelty, the logistical backbone of genocide, had been carried out by people like Gertrude, mid-level clerks, transport organizers, typists, and guards whose names never appeared in the headlines. The Ravensbrück trunk was not unique. Across Europe, similar discoveries began to surface as the 20th century neared its end. In Poland, archives reopened after the fall of communism revealed new lists of female SS personnel. In Austria, old police files unearthed correspondences between camp administrators and local officials' letters signed by women coordinating labor transfers that were in reality deportations to death camps. In the Czech Republic, a farmer discovered a metal box buried behind his barn containing letters written by a former nurse at Majdanek who had participated in lethal injections. Each document peeled back another layer of forgetting. The pattern was unmistakable. Women had not been mere assistants. They had been active participants in the infrastructure of mass murder. Their names appeared on every list, every directive, every deportation order. They had stamped the forms, counted the dead, and filed the reports that kept the killing machine running smoothly. Forensic historians began to piece together the scale of their involvement. Through handwriting analysis, cross-referenced rosters, and personnel cards, researchers found that women accounted for nearly 20% of all concentration camp staff, a staggering number that rewrote decades of historical assumptions. And yet, despite this growing body of evidence, public acknowledgement remained hesitant. In Germany, the discoveries were treated with discomfort. Why dig up old ghosts, some asked. What good does it do now? Others feared that reopening these cases would stain the reputation of ordinary German families because, in truth, many of those names belong to mothers, grandmothers, and great-aunts of people still alive. But history's purpose is not to comfort the living. It is to testify for the dead. When the Ravensbrück trunk was displayed in a small museum, visitors were struck not by its sensationalism, but by its quiet horror. There were no photographs of torture or piles of bones, just neat handwriting, organized lists in precise numbers. It forced viewers to confront a truth that few wanted to face. Genocide was not only carried out by monsters, but by administrators, neighbors, and women who measured their cruelty in columns and totals. The exhibit's curator later said, "People stand before those papers and whisper, 'How could she?' But the handwriting looks so ordinary." That is the point. It's handwriting we all recognize. Every discovery after 1990 deepened the cracks in the myth of innocence. As digital archives expanded and more records became accessible, historians identified over 14,000 women linked to SS camp operations across Europe. Some were guards, others typists, nurses, or translators. Many had claimed ignorance during post-war interrogations. The documents told another story: signatures on transfer orders, letters requesting punishments, notes tallying work units eliminated. The evidence became irrefutable, but evidence alone does not guarantee reckoning. Most of these discoveries came too late for prosecution. The perpetrators were dead. Their estates settled their families, unaware or unwilling to confront the truth. Their grandchildren grew up believing the same myths their country had long nurtured, that their ancestors had been victims of circumstance, not agents of cruelty. And yet the paper trail endures. It speaks when memory fails. It accuses when justice cannot. There is something almost poetic and terrible about the way the truth survived, not through conscience, but through clerical precision. The Nazi state that destroyed so many lives had also preserved its own guilt in carbon copies, ledgers, and signatures. The very system that tried to erase its victims accidentally immortalized itself. Today, those papers sit in climate-controlled archives in Germany, Poland, and Israel. They are studied by historians, examined by forensic analysts, read by descendants who discover, often in disbelief, that a relative once wore the uniform of the SS. The past, it seems, always finds a way to speak. Each unearthed file, each rediscovered trunk, is a reminder that time does not absolve it, only buries. And buried things, if left long enough, return with sharper edges. In 1998, when the news of the Ravensbrück trunk reached the press, one headline captured the moral weight of the discovery: the grandmother who guarded hell. It was crude, sensational, but painfully accurate. The story wasn't just about a single woman's crimes. It was about how easily evil can hide in the folds of ordinary life, and how fragile the boundary is between forgetting and denial. Because every document, every diary, every rediscovered name whispers the same truth across time: evil never really disappears. It only waits to be remembered. The reckoning that never came. Lessons in memory and justice. The war ended in 1945, but its moral aftermath never did. What began as a global effort to confront unimaginable evil slowly dissolved into bureaucracy, politics, and fatigue. In the ruins of Europe, the promise of justice, once fierce and absolute, faded into a quiet, bureaucratic compromise. By the time the last files were closed and the final survivors had spoken, a question lingered in the silence. Did the world ever truly reckon with what had happened? For the female guards and administrators of the Nazi camps, the answer was simple: most never faced judgment at all. They lived long lives, died in their beds, and were buried under headstones engraved with crosses and loving epitaphs. The world, busy rebuilding itself, chose not to look back. And by the time anyone did, the guilty had turned into harmless grandmothers, their hands folded neatly in their laps. That image of the elderly woman knitting quietly by the window became one of history's cruelest disguises. Behind it lay the truth of women who had once commanded life and death. They had watched the condemned march to the gas chambers, had ordered punishments that ended in blood, and screams had believed deeply and proudly in the ideology of extermination. Yet when the reckoning came, it arrived as a whisper, not a roar. Justice after the war was never blind, it was selective. The Nuremberg trials had given the world an illusion of moral closure. The photographs of the gallows, the headlines about justice served, had comforted millions. But Nuremberg had tried only 24 of the highest-ranking Nazi officials. Behind those few names were tens of thousands of willing participants, each responsible for their small piece of the machinery of death. And in that machinery, thousands of women had turned the gears. The Allies' post-war systems could not handle the scale. There were too many perpetrators, too few investigators, and an urgent need to stabilize a broken continent. The Soviet Union and the Western powers were already dividing Europe, preparing for the next war. In that geopolitical race, moral pursuit became a casualty, so the reckoning that should have burned through history like a purifying fire became a slow, uneven flicker, brief bursts of truth surrounded by long stretches of silence. For decades, survivors carried the weight of that failure. Many testified again and again, reliving their nightmares in front of indifferent courts. They saw their tormentors cry, plead deny, and walk free. Some wondered if the world believed them at all. They think we exaggerate, one survivor told a journalist in 1967. But I can still smell the smoke. Meanwhile, the societies that had once demanded retribution began to tire of remembering. In Germany, the Cold War offered a convenient distraction. Economic prosperity replaced moral reflection. The younger generation born after 1945 inherited both the shame and the silence of their parents. Schools taught about the Nazi period, but the lessons were clean, abstract, stripped of faces and names. Evil was something historical, not human, and yet history's ghosts do not rest quietly. When the post-war world failed to punish the guilty, it also failed to protect the truth. For every unpunished guard who lived freely, there was a survivor whose voice was dismissed, a document that went unread, a memory that slipped further into myth. Justice delayed became not only justice denied, it became justice forgotten. In the 1990s, as the last survivors entered their final years, a new generation of Germans began to dig through their family histories. Some discovered photos in attics, smiling relatives in SS uniforms, neatly dressed women standing beside barracks and barbed wire. Others found letters filled with euphemisms, special duties, resettlement work camp assignments. The realization was devastating. The enemy was not some faceless monster from the past. It was their own blood. One woman, the granddaughter of a Ravensbrück guard, said in a 2002 interview, "She taught me to pray before bed, to be kind, to work hard. I still can't understand how someone like her could do those things, but maybe that's the lesson that anyone can." Her words capture the essence of the reckoning that never came, the painful recognition that evil does not end when the perpetrators die. It lives on in the unanswered questions, in the silence that families pass down, in the reluctance of nations to face themselves fully. Germany, to its credit, eventually began to confront that silence. The 1960s brought the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, which reopened the public conscience. The 1980s and 1990s saw museums, memorials, and education reforms aimed at remembrance, but the reckoning was never complete because it could never be. The perpetrators had lived too long, justice had arrived too late, and memory had been diluted by time. For the women who had served in the camps, history's judgment was uneven. A few Irma Grease, Dorothea Binns, Hermine Braunsteiner became infamous, their faces frozen in grainy black and white photographs. They were exceptions. The rest vanished into obscurity. Some took their secrets to the grave. Others confessed privately in letters that were never published. One former SS secretary wrote in 1985, "I saw everything, but I could not stop it. Does that make me guilty? I prayed every day for forgiveness, but I never felt it come." Perhaps she was sincere, or perhaps even in confession she clung to denial, the same denial that allowed her to survive. The world's failure to deliver a complete reckoning left behind a dangerous inheritance. It taught future generations that time can wash away responsibility, that old age absolves guilt, that the passage of decades can turn cruelty into curiosity. That lesson lingers quietly corrosive beneath the surface of modern conscience. And yet, in the testimonies of survivors and the rediscovered documents, a different kind of justice endures, not the justice of courts, but of truth. Each testimony, each unearthed record, each grainy photograph is a sentence in history's final verdict. The world may have failed to punish, but it cannot claim ignorance. The evidence exists. The names are written. The past remains legible. The reckoning that never came still waits not in courtrooms, but in classrooms, in libraries, in the moral imagination of every generation that inherits this history. It waits in the stories we choose to tell and in the ones we refuse to silence. Because justice is not a moment, it is a memory that must be kept alive. If the world learned anything from the forgotten women of the SS, it should be: this evil does not die when the guilty grow old. It dies only when the truth outlives them. The war ended in 1945. The reckoning never truly did. And perhaps it never will, because the real reckoning was never meant to be theirs alone. It belongs to us. What history refuses to forget? The last witnesses are almost gone now. Their voices, once trembling with pain, now barely a whisper, have been recorded, archived, and digitized. The photographs are fading, the documents turning brittle, the court transcripts yellowing in drawers. And yet, the story refuses to end. Because history, when left unresolved, does not fade away, it echoes. You can still hear those echoes today in classrooms where young Germans study names they never learned from their grandparents. In museums where tourists walk silently past glass cases filled with uniforms, ledgers, and hairbrushes. In the uncomfortable silence that follows when someone asks, "What did your family do during the war?" That question, whispered and dreaded across generations, is the faint heartbeat of unfinished history. For decades, the narrative of World War II settled into familiarity, good versus evil, liberation versus tyranny. But beneath the simplicity lies a darker, more complicated truth that evil did not exist only in the figures on propaganda posters, but in the quiet gestures of obedience that kept the machine alive, in the secretaries who typed orders, in the teachers who repeated lies, in the women who stood by the barracks gates and believed they were only doing their jobs. This realization has reshaped the way historians and societies speak about guilt. It has forced a reckoning not only with what was done, but with who did it. For a long time, gender served as history's blindfold. Women were seen as the nurturers, the healers, the moral center of a broken world. It was easier that way. It made recovery possible. It made forgiveness bearable. But the evidence that surfaced through court records, diaries, and photographs stripped away that illusion. It revealed that the capacity for cruelty does not belong to one gender, one ideology, or one generation. It belongs to the human condition itself. That truth remains as relevant now as it was in 1945. In an age where propaganda travels faster than reason, where obedience is rewarded and empathy dismissed as weakness, the lessons of those years whisper urgently. The guards at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz were not monsters born in darkness. They were citizens shaped by fear, poverty, and belief. They sought belonging. They craved purpose. And in that craving, they surrendered their conscience to power. That surrender, repeated countless times across history, is what sustains every atrocity. It is why remembrance must be more than ritual. It must be resistance. Germany, to its credit, has tried. The nation that once sought to erase its guilt has now built its identity around remembrance. Memorials stand where command posts once rose. School children visit concentration camps every year, walking through the ruins with notebooks and wide, solemn eyes. Plaques glimmer on sidewalks, Stolperstein, stumbling stones, each engraved with the name of a victim embedded into the streets where they once lived. These acts of remembrance do not erase the crimes. They acknowledge them. They remind the living that forgetting is the first step toward repetition. But remembrance is fragile. It fades under convenience and fatigue. It risks becoming performance, a date on a calendar, a speech at a podium, a moment of silence before life resumes unchanged. True remembrance demands discomfort. It requires facing the humanity of both the victims and the perpetrators, the unbearable idea that the two once looked at each other and saw themselves reflected. In the archives of Ludwigsburg, where thousands of Nazi investigation files are kept, a researcher once remarked, "The scariest thing is not the violence in these documents. It's the handwriting. It looks like mine." That sentence captures everything history refuses to forget. When the story of the female SS guards is told, it is not to sensationalize cruelty, but to understand how evil adapts to ordinary life, how it hides behind normalcy, how it thrives on silence. These women were not exceptions. They were the evidence that the human conscience under pressure can fracture in anyone. Their lives after the war, peaceful, unpunished, respectable, serve as warnings written in flesh and time. They show how easily societies can turn away when truth becomes inconvenient, how quickly empathy can be replaced by denial, how forgiveness can mutate into forgetfulness. And still, history speaks. It speaks through the testimonies of survivors, through the trembling of an old man, remembering the sound of boots on gravel, through the cracked voice of a woman describing the day her sister disappeared into the smoke. It speaks through the grandchildren who discover a box in the attic and realize their grandmother's office job was something else entirely. It speaks every time someone stands before a memorial and understands not just with intellect, but with spirit that this could happen again, that it does happen again in different uniforms, under different banners, wherever dehumanization becomes law and conscience becomes inconvenience. That is what the story of the female SS guards ultimately teaches, that evil does not announce itself. It does not roar. It whispers. It rationalizes. It wears the face of the neighbor who smiles in the morning and closes her door at night. It teaches that the absence of accountability is not peace. It is the slow decay of truth. And so, the reckoning that never fully came still lives in every generation that inherits this memory. It is not just Germany's burden. It belongs to everyone who lives in a world that can forget too easily. Every rediscovered document, every trial transcript, every photograph is a plea from the past. Remember us honestly, not as symbols, but as people, not as history, but as warning. Because memory at its truest is not about mourning the dead. It is about protecting the living. In the end, perhaps justice was never meant to balance the scales, it was meant to keep them visible. That is what history refuses to forget, that silence is never neutral, that denial is never harmless, and that the line between humanity and inhumanity is thinner than any of us would like to believe. And so, when the last survivor's voice fades, and the last archive is digitized, and the last name is read from the last memorial wall, something must remain. Not fear, not guilt, but vigilance. The understanding that what happened once can happen again if we let comfort replace conscience. The story of the women who served the Reich is not simply about evil, it is about choice. The choice to obey, to look away, to participate, to forget. And the choice still before us to remember, because the past never really ends. It lives on in what we choose to see and in what we refuse to. And history, relentless, unmerciful, but always honest, keeps whispering its warning. Remember.